tonight's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Christopher Sylvain. He's a registered pharmacist and is the pastor of a Faithful Gospel Baptist Church in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I'm very excited to have him on to discuss a variety of topics pertaining to God, consciousness, nutrition, pharmaceuticals, the Holy Spirit, his ministry, how he relates nutrition and the treatment of the human body to that of the consciousness and the human spirit. And it's a wide-ranging dialogue I very much enjoyed, and I hope that the same goes for the audience. And as a disclaimer, as always, I seem to have failed to hit the record button on time, and there are some video lag issues throughout this episode that I also want to apologize in advance for. This will be on Spotify audio only after a while, and in which case you can listen to just the audio without the lagging video effects that you will come with watching it on YouTube. But I'm very excited to have Dr. Christopher Sylvain on the Philosophical Gospel podcast. And without further ado, here he is.
As even before then, I started teaching in a Bible college, Old Testament history and Old Testament literature, some New Testament information. And so, but not too long of that. So we started a church. So I obviously stayed involved in pastoring theology, but in teaching over at Xavier, we taught a nutrition course for a while, and then it was an herbal medicine kind of / nutrition course. Got involved in nutrition and its background in cultures, because herbal medicine is really, I would say, it's even back then, it's science-based, it is. But without the money, the drive, like the drug companies have, it's not ready for prime time, so to speak. It's not yet ready to be brought out to the public to be evidence-based. And so, but much of it, people use herbs. Much of the world use herbs, and they won't stop. It'll never happen. But much of it is culturally based. So we connected that with the theology. And eventually, so we continue teaching that. So eventually we opened up a restaurant and a pharmacy. Well, the concept there was that the food would taste good, but also be healthy.
Yeah.
So you eat the food, you won't need as much of the medicine. That was the concept. So it was right on the retail corner, a lot of fun, doing that. And so we were able to put together some of the things that we were teaching in the nutrition course and, helping people in the pharmacy, give them the food. It was all whole grains, no fried foods, actually limited red meat. We had extra lean roast beef. We use no sugars, diet drinks, soft drinks, or artificial sweeteners, so it was just water, honey we use as a sweetener.
I see.
That's the program that we use. And so right in the neighborhood where people, they enjoyed the food because it tastes good.
Yeah.
But they still needed the soft drinks, so they'd go across the street and get a soft drink and still come back to eat the healthy food. So so we did that. And so now we do pharmacy and wellness. Through COVID, we stopped doing the restaurant, temporarily for a while. So we just do it as pharmacy and wellness. But that's kind of the story.
Well, that's a pretty fascinating. The fact, especially to touch on just kind of how you said you started realizing how the theology connected to that. That's kind of a fascinating idea, that the theology and the culture surrounding nutrition and kind of permeates into the health of that culture or the health of the people. Do you mind saying a little bit more about that, about the theology aspect of that, conjoining and synergizing with that idea?
Exciting. It really, really is, because what people eat, I always say behavior is motivated, I believe, more by beliefs than anything. What people believe about life, whatever the belief is, it really, really drives behavior. And particularly food touches upon everything in our lives. Food touches upon our relationships with other people. Rarely you'll find anybody's a hermit. They eat around other people somewhere, shape or form. They learn about cooking through other people. So it's highly social, and their taste and what they like is really driven so much by their desires, and how they feel. And so all of that's theology, belief systems, that's theology. Particularly in most religions, you have some sort of dietary guidelines, a dietary, construct to it. And so when you think about nutrition, I always say it's inseparable from beliefs. And everybody believes something. So whether it's an organized belief in, the basics, 5 religions or whatever, there's some sort of belief that's somewhat guiding, their foods that they eat, whether it's healthy, whether it's not healthy. And you add in their knowledge of what's in the food. That's, another part. And then the body responds back based upon the belief system or the amount of stress people have and their disease states. The body will respond in what tastes good and what doesn't, and what control they have on whether they'll eat or not, or what they'll eat. I think I lost your volume.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I was still on mute. Yeah, that's fascinating to think about, because it implies that we have basically that as we change our beliefs, it's kind of important. Yeah, like we have to change our cravings, and our desires are so intimately related kind of with our beliefs that unless we foundationally restructure how we view the world, essentially, and how we view ourselves within it, we can't really make a long-term change to our diet and nutrition and things like that, because we don't see the value in it. Maybe because what's resonating with me is kind of, it seems like you need objectivity and association with something to place as your actualized pathway, your moral framework or something like that. And it seems to me kind of like as you restructure that, you can begin to treat your body better because it's in line with how you believe. So the Bible and these ancient texts kind of seem to speak on how to treat the body, how to act, and how to be within the world as far as the body's concerned. And as you begin to identify more with those kinds of beliefs, you give less credence maybe to your taste and sensory pleasures. And so it maybe makes it a little easier to do these things simultaneously, to realize that there's more than just a change of, but if you change behavior, you must, what's that changing relative to, kind of?
100%. Say if you look at it purely from a theological standpoint, and I'll take what we preach, because I'm a pastor. I've been pastoring 12 years, preaching 20 years. We focus specifically on the belief system, and we believe in the supernatural, because obviously any religion by definition is believing in the metaphysics, the supernatural. So obviously in that belief system, and I always say this, whether the supernatural exists or not, and that's from a scientific standpoint, because particularly nutrition, we have to look at it scientifically. And so whether the supernatural, somebody believes it exists or not, if somebody believes in the supernatural, then it affects their motivation and their drive. And that's a guarantee. It would affect them. So if somebody believes that, if I trust God, if I believe in who he is, I trust God, then it gives a focus other than on self. And so my pleasure is not my driver. My hedonic pleasures don't really drive me. What drives me is being in oneness with God, or in that relationship with him. And so by having a different focus, then it relieves stress. It takes that heavy desire away. And so at that point, and again, when we go back to nutrition, the reason we eat is to achieve some level of homeostasis, to achieve some level of balance. And so by having that faith, then that obviously places us in a position without having those external drivers saying you have to eat, you want to eat, I want the sugar, fat, salt, and grease, I got to have it. So it releases that. And so, and then again, religion that was worth its weight in salt does believe in the supernatural. That then you have something else going on outside of what we can see in the natural realm.
No, that's well said. I think, like you said, it's scientifically, and the literature even backs it up. It's a viable scientific statement to say that whenever someone acts as if the metaphysical realms exist, things become better for those people in a statistically significant manner, whether or not it be in hedonistic desires with addiction, with drugs, or with food. And it seems to me that even in the literature, when you look at transformative experiences for individuals who change these behaviors, because like you're saying, these behaviors like eating and then our hedonistic desires being satisfied with however we seek that immediate gratification out in the world, those behaviors become so ingrained, it seems like, into our normal actions, that it becomes difficult to change unless you acknowledge there's something out there maybe a little bit more powerful than you that can help you through those kinds of behavioral changes. Maybe it seems like to me that some of these 80 to 90% of people who've been in an addiction for a long time, when they stop, it's almost always, if they stop over a long-term period, they can almost always retroactively attribute that to some kind of experience that helped them out of that, it seems like. And I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on, we're talking about belief and behavioral changes. And as far as nutrition and changing that, do you see something similar like that, maybe applying into addiction behaviors that are addictions to illicit drugs and things like that, that the theology surrounding that kind of, it could be relative to this as well?
Yeah, well, again, it's perfect, because when you look at sugar, sugar has a dopaminergic response. Sugar affects not just the dopamine system, but serotonin and so sugar can be just as addictive as many of the other drugs in and of itself, cocaine, opiates, and so forth. So, and that's the thing with nutrition, because if we can just regress for a second, the whole concept of ultra processed foods, if we really, really look at it, we're looking at sugar as the main driver. That's controversial, but more or less, that's the only product within ultra processed foods that have that true addiction potential as a substance addiction. And so we take that same concept and we move it to, cocaine. We move it to even alcohol, cigarettes, nicotine. And so if we're only concerned about self, then how much value are we giving ourselves? How much value do we give? Do we even matter who we are? And so if we don't feel that we matter, then we take away the agency, that drive to want to be better. If we don't feel, if my best is never going to be good enough amongst my peers, that I don't mind harming myself. I have no desire to even be better. And so when theologically, if who I am was created, and so therefore I have a high standard in which I want to meet, and I can meet it because who created me didn't make a mistake, so therefore who I am and who I see myself to be doesn't have anything to do with who I was created to be. So therefore I want to get better to be who I was created to be. So therefore I have agency, I have drive. I can go through the withdrawal periods of sugar. I can go through the withdrawal periods, because alcohol, it's almost deadly. You're going to DTs. Opiates, it's not deadly, but it's so difficult. People are nausea, vomiting, the pain of withdrawal from opiates. And there's no better there's nothing. You can use Suboxone or naloxone or whatever, and they have to go through that pain. And what would allow them to go through that pain other than believing that their self-worth, is more than what they could see with their natural eye?
Yeah, that's well said once again. I think that you're right. And I think what you're kind of saying, to summarize it a little bit, is nihilistic views of the world that remove the sense of meaning just from being inherent to existence. Then at that point, you can't justify allowing oneself to maybe suffer through trials that are better for you in the long run. It's almost substituting instant gratification with the knowledge that in the future self will be better for your actions today, even if it's immediately dissatisfactory to the senses and things like that. And so I think it's really important that meaning and manufacturing meaning within your life is important behind any behavioral changes, is essentially what we were kind of getting at here, is that manufacturing a sense of purpose that's inherent to just existence allows you start from somewhere to basically annihilate nihilism in your framework and know that you matter, and then go upwards from there in your journey towards actualization. But any fundamental behavioral change, whether it's eating too much ice cream or indulging in too many basically hedonistic behavioral patterns like addiction, there's something ultimately. I talked about it with Dr. Carl Friston, the idea of the Murkoff blanket, something that surrounds everything else and encapsulates the rest of the system. It's if you don't make something change in relation to what you consider ultimately to be your driving principles, then it's going to be hard to make long-term behavioral changes. And I think that's brilliantly captured in what you're trying to say here. And to kind of just to ask you real quick, backtracking that, I've noticed in a lot of Christian contemplative and meditative practices too, you were talking about the sense of craving or desire. That's an odd emotion to kind of relay linguistically. Sometimes when you think about it, what drives you to want something so badly that you eat, whether you eating ice cream or drinking a soda or engaging in drinking of alcohol or anything. It's a weird feeling because if you kind of stop and pay attention to how that craving or desire actually feels and look at it metacognitively, it's something that arises and it kind of just goes away. But if you can watch it arise and see what it feels like in relation to your other emotions, it's kind of an odd one. So I wanted to kind of backtrack and ask you about that emotion of craving and desire and how you see that and how you kind of subdue that when you're talking about this with people who are looking to change these behaviors.
Yeah, and that's a powerful question, because actually that has to move into the metaphysical realm. Because purely in the natural realm, I don't think you're able to disassociate. That connection would always be there. And that means it's not that you can't overcome cravings, because people can always overcome cravings and they'll break away from addictions and so forth without even moving into the metaphysical realm. But I always say they're trading one addiction for another. Because it could be success. It could be, I need money. It could be, I don't want to lose my marriage or something like that. So, but from the metaphysical side, and by placing faith in God, again, monotheism, I think is the concept, leads to egalitarianism, which creates relationships, stable relationships is more than me. And so when somebody has faith in God, what they're saying, God is a spirit. And so it's recognizing that I'm going to trust God, who is a spirit. I recognize that part of me is spirit. And so therefore that spirit can take control over and I noticed you had mentioned mind or brain, then the spirit actually takes control of the mind. And so at that point, in that metaphysical belief that my spirit is driving, which is connected to God's spirit. And so therefore I have my agency switches. I have a different driver at that point. And so, and that's where, again, in Christian beliefs, we can back it up with the Bible. We can always look at what the Bible says as validation to say, okay, I am valuable. I am created. I am important. And so therefore, I follow that spirit that says that. And so therefore, my drivers, my desires for the sugar, my desire for the drug or the alcohol, at that point, if I trust God, then those desires get suppressed. They don't have to be eliminated, but they have to be subservient to my faith. And so that becomes the success.
Oh, well, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think the Bible lays the groundwork and always provides a framework you can return back to whenever you have doubts or inhibitions or disinhibitions that occur a lot of times. Whenever you want to inhibit a certain behavior and the desire's there to do so, it's like almost you're in an internal debate with your higher self or your consciousness. And it's kind of like what Paul says in the Bible when he speaks on the flesh desires what the spirit doesn't, and vice versa. It's clearly, those clearly weren't just words of a bygone era. They're very applicable now whenever anybody, I mean, what Christian or not, if you believe in a spirit or if you don't, substitute the word spirit for conscience, substitute it for your inner dialogue. It applies universally. Almost you could probably get most of the world to buy into that once they're developed adults, that there's something weird about the higher self longing for a better future, and then the immediate present self and the hedonistic desires kind of competing against that element of it. And you said a lot there. When we're talking about mind and brain and body, as a pharmacist and just as a Christian and a doctor, and what how do you see the mind as it relates to God, or to spirit, and to consciousness? And do you see, if you don't mind me jumping onto this kind of subject matter, just because I have a chance to speak with you, I wanted to see kind of how you look at the word spirit in relation to consciousness, and how ultimately what consciousness kind of ends up meaning to you when we talk about mind and brain. And if we want to change our behaviors, we almost have to recognize consciousness as being, to me, it seems like integral part of our spirit. And I kind of wanted to see how you look at that, maybe.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, because that's it. And currently the so-called hard problem of consciousness, that attempting to define consciousness without spirit, people can do it. Believe me, a lot of books have been written about consciousness and this so-called hard problem of reflection, and whether only humans have it or whatever. But from a theological standpoint, it's working too hard. You know what I mean? It's working real hard, trying to find out a way that it can be explained without moving into metaphysics. And it's the same thing of, quantum mechanics. It's like entanglement. To explain entanglement without moving into metaphysics it's just too hard. Like, why? It doesn't make sense to me, But I think, it's important for science to not get entangled in theology. Science should be able to run freely without being constrained by anything that the Bible says. It should continue to look at it. But when we move into people making decisions and looking at our life and our own consciousness, then we have to look at it practically, because the brain cannot answer everything that happens in our reflective mind and our consciousness. And so consciousness is outside of the physical realm. Consciousness is a part of who we are. And so the spirit isn't the conscious, but the spirit can actually cleanse the conscious. All right. And that's the term spiritually, because, all right, and let's even go back. We're mind, we're body, and we're spirit. And we say that theologically, if we have a creator, so therefore the creator is spirit, he created us, and that gives us our agency. That's what drives evolution, so to speak. It makes everything run. So if the spirit then can take control of our mind and cleanse our consciousness, and allowing our conscious mind then to operate in peace and homeostasis and relaxation. Without the spirit, then the conscience is in that heavy battle. It's not like we ever eliminate the battle, all right? But we're not in that heavy battle, because once we trust God, God is fighting the battle for us. We just have to believe it. And that's what faith is. Faith is the substance of believing that God is handling that battle that's going on in our conscious mind, the battle that's going on in our desires. So I have faith. So therefore, if I trust God, hey, I don't worry. I surrender my will to God's will. I surrender my agency to his agency. So therefore, the spirit then, takes control. Now we have the conscious mind and our conscience. And so, we have a conscience that we believe everybody has. Everybody knows not to kill children. You know what I mean? That's just not good. Everybody knows not to rape children. So therefore, the spirit then kind of washes and cleans everything, and it lines everything up. So whereas it lines it up, guess what it does? It lines it up with the universe. Not only do we have homeostasis, we have symbiosis with the entire life force. Everything that's living, then, we line up with. I always say man is the only one that can do evil, mankind, and it's somewhat debatable, but I believe that it can be obvious. You don't find, any animal that can laugh at killing. You know what I mean? That's something that they do. It's a part of their drive. And so since we have the ability to do evil, then God is good. God allowed evil, but then we should focus on going against evil and doing good and lining up with the rest of the universe that can't do evil. So anyway, so that's where I feel the spirit relates to the conscious and conscience, and it affects the body and our drives.
Awesome. No, that's beautifully said. It really, it's such an enigmatic question to ask. And so when I pose that question, it's kind of what I talk about on my channel a lot. And every time I ask it, I know it's a loaded question, and I know it has a lot of moving parts. But I think there, theologically, you kind of put words to what I haven't been able to in my own thoughts, about how that interrelationship. It's so intricate. When the Christian doctrine talks about the Trinity, it invokes a lot of fragmentation of beliefs within the church, and then it almost created its own pathway within the doctrine because of the disalignment with the Trinitarian outlook. And so whenever you talk about consciousness and mind and brain and a conscious mind versus a non-conscious mind, all of those things, it invokes a lot of intrigue, but it also invokes, like you said, a lot of complicated answers for what seems to be overcomplicating the answer, and almost creating problems by nature of making them so complicated. And so the way you just kind of broke down the spirit, and it's what I want to ask you to further that is the spirit in relation to agency, because of course there's philosophical debates that run on and on, even into today, about maybe free will being an illusion. And of course, I choose to not subscribe to that, just because I feel like even if it's one of those things where even if it were true, it'd be better to once again act as if it weren't, because it's damaging to the social sphere of being, really, if you start to dispense with such notions of illusory self and illusory free will. But I wanted to ask you, how do you view agency when we talk about nature and nurture? I know you've done, I've seen a few of some really neat stuff you've retweeted and talked about in relation to genes and God and the interrelationship between that. And so I kind of wanted to ask you, how do you see free will in relation to what we just spoke on, and how does it operate for you epigenetically? Do you see some kind of intrigue in the new science that kind of talks about epigenetics and the potential of activating and deactivating genes within our genome?
That's exciting. It really, really is. I like the way you placed that and framed it. Let me see if I can grab a hold of it.
Yeah.
I think first, as a base, we have to look at science and empirical thinking and the metaphysical part. And I think science is doing a good job of searching and looking, because by definition they really have to be cautious in looking at the metaphysical side, but the metaphysical side still can be metaphysics. It's like I always look at it like secularism or atheism is, if we look at it through evolution, we were evolved to worship God and trust God. Every society known to man has always had some sort of theology, so it's only recently in the past, I guess, through 400 or 500 years that is popular, where science has moved away from the concept of theology and metaphysics, and attempting to answer these questions without looking at metaphysics. And it's giving them a hard time. So their understanding of free determinism and not having free will, I actually believe, now this is the thing, I actually believe that is more scientifically accurate, just without the metaphysics. And I look at that, because if you take out metaphysics, how do you argue for free will? If you leave God out, if there is no God, then who are we and why are we here? And what that means is that it's very, very limited, which is true. Obviously, I do believe in free will, which means that, but for those who do believe in holism, but don't believe in God, then that to me is the challenge. Then what is it? What creates free will? What creates our agency? And in fact, then again, what is happening in let's say like the microbiome, where we have these one cell bacterium that produce and manufacture serotonin. Like, how do they do that? How do ants able to operate as a colony? How are birds able to do this? And emergent things. So how do we explain emergence without dealing with metaphysics? So the deterministic guys are saying, no, emergence is that's just emergence. It's physical. We'll figure it out later. I think they're closer to being right from the scientific side, because once we move into emergence, not having a metaphysical relationship to it, connection, then to me, I always say, you guys are in theology now. Y'all are, like, you're moved away from determinism. You've moved away from science. Now you're going to have to walk along with the theologians and those who see God, or those that have belief systems. And it's kind of happening. You have more discussions now. People are asking and they want to have the discussion. So anyway, so then if we believe in that God gives us free will, then we have to believe in Satan. That's where it becomes challenging. Okay, if there is a God, then people are dying, bad things are happening. So obviously God allowed, that's where monotheism comes in. God allowed for evil. All right. And so then we have a Satan. Well, that's, we look at, Christian theology. And that's what I love about it. It's based upon grace. If God is perfect, we've all gone against God. So therefore God must be forgiving. That's Jesus and the cross. So obviously if he's forgiving, then there's somebody forgiving, and then he's active. Life is still going on. That's that Trinitarian doctrine you just spoke about. God has all power, one God. He's forgiving. That's the Son. He's active. That's the Holy Spirit. Okay. So we trust this one God in three persons. Then the power of Satan is defeated. All right. That's the whole idea of the cross. We just left, Easter. So if Satan is defeated, then his power is defeated, but his presence is still active. All right. What that means is that once we give our life to God, then Satan no longer has power over us, but his presence is still there. So if his presence is still there, he can tempt us, but we have power to not succumb to it if we trust God. All right. So we have free will. Now watch this. I always say that free will is limited, because once we trust God, we're married to God. We have a ring on our finger, spiritual. We're married. It's eternal. It happened by faith, not because we worked so hard, not that we were so good. It happened by faith and faith alone, and it's eternal. So we're married, just like a regular marriage. And God said, guess what? You have free will, but not enough free will to me to divorce you. God will never give us a divorce. He loves us. So he's like, I'm with you forever. It's like a father and a child. I give you free will, but I'm always be your daddy. You know what I mean? So you don't have that much free will to divorce me, to kick me out. Like I tell my wife, you don't have that much free will. I'm always,
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, and it's kind of that right there reminds me of in C.S. Lewis. I don't know how much of his work you like or enjoy, but I've recently read that Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and just he has an argument in there about free will, and he's using that analogy you just pointed to, where he's talking about would a mother allow a child to fail whenever she's raising him? Like, and the analogy he uses is he's like, well, yeah, of course, free will's like this. He's like, if a mother has a younger son or a daughter, and they're 5 or 6 years old, the mother, it's late at night, but she's ready for the child to go to bed. She wants to wake up in the morning and the child's room is clean, but right now it's not. So C.S. Lewis puts forth the argument, would the mother say, all right, son or daughter, go and clean your room, and that way it's clean in the morning? Or would she just go do it herself and clean the room herself and get it? That way she knows in the morning it's clean and taken care of. No, she's going to let the son start teaching him how to utilize agency in the world by saying, go to your room, get it cleaned up and get it rearranged, and trust that in the morning he had used his own agency to avoid skipping that chore. But of course she's still going to allow him to fail and the room to not be clean in the morning by a sense of letting them have a little bit of their agency at the beginning. So I find that kind of a neat way of representing kind of maybe what you're saying too.
Well, that's amazing, because again, the mind needs that. The mind has to grow. The mind has to be challenged. We'll never grow without horrible pain. That a parent will allow the child, a parent said, it's hurting me more than it's hurting you, and the child is like, are you serious? This is unbearable to me. But the parent is saying, I'll never put more on you than you can bear. So the child does have free will. But then the reverse is true, because for those who decide that they want to operate independently and not recognize a higher power, that they were created, then they decide, hey, I'm going to handle everything on my own, based upon my money or my family or the instructions that I have. Then what do they have to say that their self-worth is more than what they own, or more than what's around them? Then their self-worth is based upon things, their knowledge or something like that. Well, again, if we believe in God, we believe in the devil. The devil loves that, because then he can twist that to say that you live for your money, or you live for this, or that. That a person at that point, what they live for is not have anything to do with their own value, because we're more important than anything else, any material things that we can live for, status and so forth. So at that point, do they really have free will? And that's why I go along with the deterministic folk. All right, that free will doesn't really exist, because then they'll operate based upon their desires, based upon what's going to advance them. And they believe that they have free will, but I think the argument can be made that they don't, that they're really attempting to, their agency is based upon their own self-survival or the survival of their group. Now, the challenge is that, if we look at Christianity, particularly, over the 2,000 years, that's infused itself in much of our theologies. And many theologies, I think, grab a hold to determinism, to not release the spiritual part, so I think that, Jesus dealt with that, his argument with the Pharisees and Sadducees, or Paul, when he argued with the legalists. To me, those legalists were actually having deterministic arguments. It was the same argument that you have in science today, they believe that if I do this, God's going to love me. No, God loves you no matter what you do. You know what I mean? But if you love him, then that should drive you to want to please him, that type of thing. So.
Yeah, there's, like you had mentioned earlier, symbiosis. It becomes a symbiotic, mutualistic relationship between ourselves and the creator whenever we operate in conjunction with it. And a lot of times at least in my mind, I try to break down a lot of these topics into analogies or metaphors that can grab a hold of these ideas in a more palatable manner for those who listen, and for those who may not have the academic desire to go and try to investigate some of these hard problems, as they're so dubiously misnomered. But I think that a good analogy kind of that I've come up with of agency is that of a dynamic blueprint for building that kind of shuffles between parties, where you have an architect construct a building via the blueprint, pass it along to a contractor who employs tradesmen to construct the building. Well, within that process, it's a cycle of the contractor receiving the authorized blueprint, installing the building, and inevitably that gets dramatically altered in the construction of that building. There's doors put here, there's corridors forged in this area, they have to add a ceiling here. These things happen in the course of a construction of a building that deviates significantly from the original blueprint, but not so much so that it's out of code compliance with the standards of what a building should be. And then it goes back to the architect to make that verification. And so to make sure that at the end of the project, it does at least comply minimally with what the standard is for that building, so to speak. And so I kind of think of maybe will and agency and our relationship to the ultimate architect of the universe would exist somewhat like that, where we would have to operate within the confines of what he considers to be the blueprint, but how we go about making and molding our own corridors and hallways within this building needs to be in synergy with what he intends us for.
I love it, and I think all of the epigenetic changes that happens with it, I think genes respond to that. I think hormones respond to that. I think, the signaling pathways respond to that. Everything in the body responds to it because, again, the concept, when we're in symbiosis, the body's in homeostasis, then we achieve something called peace. we're just in peace. That's peace in the midst of storms and turmoils that can go around us, because we understand the blueprint. We can always go back and look at that blueprint, and we can bring it back to nutrition. I think that's where, one thing that man has not been able to do is make food, because if we leave the food alone the way it was prepared naturally. Now, again, there's something emergent about that fruit and vegetables, and whether we meat or whatever, whenever we attempt to process in ways outside of a blueprint, then we create temptations that may be difficult for us to handle. So it's kind of all connected.
Yeah, good. Yeah, there's a good connection there between basically these blueprints and something like the Bible operating as a living map for this dynamically causal, semi-causal world that we exist as agents, semi-agents within. As metaphysical as it is to conceptualize any of those things with language, I think you've kind of done a good job in merging all that together here. And if you don't mind now, I kind of want to take that and ask you. You mentioned Satan, mentioned God, and those kinds of things. Recently coming back to Christianity and committing to a framework with this, that I've always, as I was going through my journey back to the Bible, and as I've been, and it involved a lot of meditative practices and kind of going through the Hindu religion and the customs from the East. And there's a lot of emphasis in those customs on the practice of meditation and the practice of contemplation, and what those practices do. Well, I want to ask you about that, but also I want to dash in there a little bit of my subjective experience really quickly and see what you think. Which my subjective experience was that meditation, as I started doing it more and practicing it on a more regular basis, I began to see things just more naturally as a state of not dualisticness, where there's evil and good, but it almost induced this feeling of self-transcendent or self-dissolution. I don't want to say transcendence, because that seems to carry this air of superiority to me whenever I use that word. I mean, I don't think it does that. I don't think I don't want to frame it like I'm ascending, but more so that it's dissolving the thing that makes you selfhood separate from other. And so I began to naturally see the world more monistically, more the monism of the mind and body and matter became more pressing to me in my thoughts. But then coming back to Christianity, it answered a lot of questions that these Eastern practices didn't answer for me. But then it seemed like it was more of a dualistic framing, to where there's the stark separation. There's a benevolent, or not a benevolent, but a loving creator that's in constant dueling with an evil force. And the Eastern practices were more like everything is one. And so I was more or less trying, since we had talked, you talked about Satan and things like that. I wanted to ask you, do you see meditation as a practice being something, first of all, that, how do you see it in your view as a clinician and a practitioner of medicine and a pharmacist? And also, how do you see the world in relation to a dualistic or a monistic framework?
Well, interesting, because that's kind of what's happening today, particularly in healthcare. We have a major drive in healthcare, towards mindfulness and more through Eastern practices. And many studies have been done and showing the value of meditation, which I think is important. But it is different from Christianity. And I always say that, because literally Eastern practices are more comfortable within the concept of science. And so it's much easier to work. But Christianity, the difference is that Christianity is monotheism. It believes in one God, period. All right. He has one, he's omnipotent. He has all power. Two, he's omniscient. He knows everything. And omnipresent. So he's everywhere. So a God that's everywhere has all power. And our surrender unto God, our believing that God has all power, that automatically means we have none. So we automatically, like the police said, put your hands up. Hey, God says, put your hands up. All right, I put my hands up. I surrender my will to your will. And, God, in fact, we're instructed to pray, let thy will be done. So in our meditation, because the Bible is clear, meditate on his word day and night, meditate on him. So meditation is important, obviously, that we get before God and literally get into his presence. We can speak to him. We should pray without ceasing. That in a way is relating directly to meditation. And so, but the focus is on God, not on us. And so that's where it's like we're allowing God to control our agency. Let his will be done. That means whatever happens is on God. That takes the stress away. It's not on us. God, you're in control. So therefore, good things are happening, you're in control. If storms are happening, you're in control. And that's where that second person of the Trinity, Jesus, comes in. He died on a cross, whereas by believing in this Trinitarian gospel, then all of our sins are forgiven, past, present, and future. So we may sin. We will. It's going to happen. All right. Again, we're going to do something that we didn't want to do, but the temptation overtook us. But it won't be a lifestyle. It won't be the way we live. We'll fall. But guess what? The sins are already forgiven. Now, in meditation, in non-monotheistic religions, and so obviously the focus has to be on us. To me, that's stressful. You know what I mean? No matter how much I put my focus on today or tomorrow, or if I don't deal with next year, if I want to focus now, or whatever way the focus is, if my issues and my problems aren't released, then I'm still going to deal with guilt and shame, because I'll always do things. It's going to happen. It won't be a lifestyle, but no matter how somebody perfect he is, how can we be as perfect as God? How can we meet his standard? He's omnipotent. So our humility comes from recognizing that he has all power. And so I think that's the major difference in, like, when we spend that time within our own mind, our mental framework, to allow God to be the focus of it, then, we can enjoy that time. There's joy there, as opposed to when our focus is on our own thoughts and who we are. So it's a difference. So monotheism, and I speak about monotheism because I think that's a helpful term when we're relating it to science and particularly, metaphysics. But when I speak about monotheism, I'm speaking about Christianity, because of, as like C.S. Lewis' place, it's the only religion where grace is the driver. Now, don't get me wrong. I think, I'm evangelistic totally, but we respect all religions. And so it's free will. People have free will. They do whatever they want. And we love and we enjoy. We have fun together. And so it's no negative. But what I do like about the Islamic religion, or I even, and I'd say the Hindu religion, then Christianity to me is one that in its heavy evangelism has to back off in a sense. But I don't think, I think religions, people should be free to practice any religion that they like. And the fact that it's evangelistic, so be it.
Yep, I agree. I think that's an interesting point, is there's that monotheistic aspect that's almost unique to Christianity. And if you look at, like you mentioned, the religion of Islam, it seems like in the Prophet Muhammad, their religion is very, very foundation. It's almost seems that its foundation built upon the Old Testament in general, the Pentateuch and those old books of Moses and the Abrahamic aspects of the stories. It almost seems like if you look at Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and those Eastern religions, and you start to go through them, there's really not a lot of there's not a lot of mentality in those religions focused on acknowledgement of a true personal, intimate relationship with God. It's more of, he's the universal consciousness. He's the ultimate framework by which we all exist. But yes, there is no potential really for an intimate personal relationship between you and him. And it seems to in the East trend towards the dissolution of self, so much so that you beckon or call for and open the door for nihilism to introduce itself if you adopt these practices in the West. And so that's kind of where my cautionary tale arises from. I'm not from an academic background, but when I talk about the gospel and everything, and my journey back to it is to provide hopefully somewhat of a cautionary warning to kind of in line with what you just said, is that if you put so much of that burden of that transcendence and that idea of oneness upon you and you only, eventually, if that becomes and manifests as a reality for you, when we're so used to a self and other landscape in America and in the West, it's an alarming it's an alarming personal transformation that can begin to kind of occur for some when they start to reshape their beliefs through meditation, because it does induce insights and it does kind of promote and it start to feed into how you act and your agency in the world and those kinds of things. And so I would agree with you. I think there's some value there, but ultimately focusing that mindfulness upon something like a monotheistic God and putting your faith in. And so, but what I really like what you said is about forgiveness. Going through philosophy, what I found is Plato and all of these guys from ancient Greece have a lot of wisdom. However, they lack the ability to forgive us for the sins we know we're going to do in the future. We don't have the ability to forgive and ourselves for what we already have done and what we know we're going to continue to do. So I wanted to ask you there's like this written into what we already know we're going to mess up and make mistakes all throughout our life. And so it seems like a missing piece of the puzzle, the forgiveness, that it almost seems like grace and forgiveness has to permeate this existence if we're going to accept that we will always continue to do things we know aren't not to be the most virtuous and the most good.
Yeah, it's recognizing, again, once we believe in the all-powerful God who's perfect, our humanity has to blow up to say, hey, well, I'm not. God has all power. I'm not. God is perfect. And, any self-reflection is like, no, I'm not. The society is not. And so therefore, without forgiveness, then we have guilt and shame, because we have a conscience, and we're conscious. So therefore, that battle will always go on in the mind. And, there's two ways of knowing God. I always say that. One is by nature, and the other way is by the Bible. And I love what's going on in science today, because even if we look at evolutionary biology, even some of evolutionary psychology, what makes us survive, what allows us to survive, we're finding that monogamy, pair bonding, we find that treating people well, good relationships, egalitarianism, that advance, again, that's part of that symbiosis. Homeostasis matches symbiosis, but it also matches homoousios, which is balancing the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit. That was the arguments in the early church. You really have to balance those. So when we balance the Father, balance the Son, balance the Holy Spirit, we believe in one God has all power, but we believe in the powerful work on the cross of the Son. And he literally was able to only one walk perfect for 33 years, no sin whatsoever. So that's our guide to say, okay, how did Jesus do it? Not just what did he do, but why did he do it? What was his consciousness? He had a God consciousness. He was a man. He gave up his godness to have the same epigenetic changes. He had the same nutritional issues. He was off his bread when he had fasted 40 days. He didn't eat it. He was tempted with power, with egotism, to say, go throw yourself down the mountain, all of those things. And so Jesus was able to do it. Well, that gives us our model, but his whole key was his death, that substitutionary death. He said, I'll become sin for you. In fact, I'll hold every sin that you've ever done, past, present, and future. We recognize you're my child now. I won't let you go down like that. I won't let you die. That you're going to live with me forever. Just like, when you get married, you tell your wife, hey, you can't mess this up. We're here for richer or for poor, sickness and health, and so, but watch this. So the mind reacts. So think about egalitarian relationships. I always say that Christianity was a way to present God. Jesus presented God, but God existed before Christ. From Adam and the beginning of time, whether Adam and Eve was 10 billion years old or 12,000 years old. I like the 12,000 because that's when agriculture started, whatever, but it doesn't matter, And so, man has always needed a forgiver, we always need that grace, and our bodies and minds, to me, trying to function without grace is, let's even put it this way. If we look at it, we've had societies that were egalitarian societies that believed in a high God, monotheistic, where everybody was treated equally, hunter-gatherer or whatever, and they have always existed. It's nothing new. I believe that it's just more difficult now. It's been more difficult now, and then rightfully so. Since Christ came, I think it's even more difficult because the choices are starker. But still, to expand, to have a loving society, we have to have that forgiveness. I don't see any other way around it. I could take care of me and my family and our group, but what about the broader world? You know what I mean? What about loving the broader world? Unless we go to them offering, hey, I'm going to give you, and that's what the gospel is. Hey, you want to have all your sins forgiven? Let me show you how. And then we move on.
Exactly. No, that's poetically said. And I think too, I think there's a lot of merit to what you said, that what is that element and that universal binding glue that kind of brings together all these virtues in such a positive light? Because evolution itself, I've found and struggled to find within it a doctrine within evolutionary psychology that really fully gets the arising of altruistic tendencies and the behavior to prioritize other over self in a situation that even may be detrimental to your own self. Some people still prioritize other. They'll jump into a lake to save a child whenever they're sacrificing their own life potentially. That these things are built in, they're hardwired into the spirit, into the consciousness of human reason and of human intellect. And the moral law, as we were talking, and C.S. Lewis would define it as what's the ultimate law of man, that we all, just like if I go out in public and I punch somebody, that's gonna be universally seen as an inappropriate behavior towards other by self. However, everybody's going to agree almost that was inappropriate. It's going to be universal. I mean, we just saw what happened with Will Smith and Chris Rock, not to go with that, but you see right there, you see a universal outcry against that behavior. Where does that outcry come from? What's the crux of why do we care that he slapped him? Well, because we all see unwarranted violence as being wrong. Well, who said that? Who said that 2,000 years ago? Jesus. I mean, he said, "Treat thy neighbor as thyself." Well, we don't want ourselves to be slapped. So, wow, this moral law, that ultimately permeates the fabric of our existence and drives kind of our agency. Well, it's kind of, why do we want? Well, evolution doesn't explain that through just survival of the fittest alone. It doesn't capture this element too holistically to me. And so I think, like you're saying, to nurture the fruits of the spirit, the gentleness, the self-control, the kindness, all of these emotions, to nurture those, one has to acknowledge the existence of something that can give you those, and acknowledge that you may not know everything. And so I think relinquishment of that is a unique point on your end there.
Yeah, I love the word relinquishment. That is it literally, because again, as recognizing that if once we recognize that there's something else outside, that there's another power, and science has helped us so much. We're right, I think, in the midst of a beautiful place where for years science was comfortable with being deterministic. All the way from Newton. And I think that's this whole Enlightenment thing where the religion started bowing to science, the denominations. I always say that we have to separate denominations from churches and separate churches from people. Just because denominational doctrines became very, very legalistic and so forth, that doesn't mean churches operated that way. That doesn't mean Christians operated that way. And so, because we believe, science was believing that it had the answers, that we're going to be able to solve everything. But I think in the past, particularly 20 or 40 years, even in the past 5 years, we're recognizing now that what we don't know is more than what we'll ever know. You know what I mean? There's so much, and people can say, well, we're going to learn it in 200 years. Well, that's like saying you'll never learn it. It's just not going to happen, and so people have to be left with something, to hold on to. And that means there's God. And until y'all figure it out, we'll relinquish it and trust God. And we're believing that the creation can never figure out the creator. It's a power differential that's set. It's like, we never, fighting the policeman doesn't work. He has guns and tanks. That's just not going to work. God created, so therefore relinquishment, to me, is obviously, again, it's the only comfortable way to allow homeostasis to occur.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think I agree, and I think too that there's a lot to be said about that, because it's even from a Buddhist perspective or a Hindu perspective or just a comparative philosophical or religious take on this subject. It's a cornerstone to the Zen Buddhist practices that, and there's a lot of comparative religious study that kind of brings this into Christianity as well. But it's the idea of unknowing being the true source of knowing, and as philosophically defeating as that sounds, it pairs right into this, in my opinion. And Alan Watts, somebody who I listen to a lot, who, was a minister for a long time in the Christian religion, like you yourself as a pastor, but he could probably relate to that. But Alan Watts was a comparative religious studier and wrote books on the art of Zen, but also was a Christian preacher for a long time. And he brings that in a lot into what you're saying about whenever you relinquish the idea that you could know it all, and then realize that every time you learn something new, you're actually realizing more or less that you know nothing. Once that insight becomes a cycle for you, every time you learn something new, you're like, wow, that's pretty profound. But instead of the profundity of it becoming the primary cornerstone to your focal point of what you're learning, it's not the profundity, it's the profundity of what you don't know, because you continually are updating your beliefs. And eventually you start to realize that, I talked to a philosopher of science on here and about the philosophy of science and really what the nature of science is. I mean, when we go back 100 years, we had people saying that there's no need for students to enter into the physics in college anymore because they've got it all figured out. There was professors saying that to students, saying, hey, don't recommend, your family and your children to come into physics. And this was in 1907 and 1908. Some of the world's leading physicists are quoted saying things like that, where the egotism comes out in science a lot, where we know it all. And then you see 100 years later, we're even going back to overthrowing some of Einstein's general parameters. So it puts us on a pace to know that, look, everything we hold true as fact almost is all guaranteed within 100 years, if it follows this trajectory, to be overturned. And so if we start looking at that way, that science is almost a dynamic study of what we hold true right now, but it won't be true in 100 years. And so you start to realize the feebleness of human knowing.
Literally, yeah, and because that's where, scientism as opposed to science, if left alone, is a beautiful thing. It's a great way to understand the world and look at the world and see what's going on, recognizing that it's something that we know right now. That's it. That's as much as science can do. And I think that's where physics, classical physics, quantum physics is starting to recognize that it's what we know now. We have pretty accurate predictions moving forward or whatever, but there are big black holes in our understanding, and using that as a pun, that science should bring us to God. Originally Newton was a theologian. His concept was to bring us to God. Even look at Darwin before he spent that time. He thought he would have a better understanding of God. And I think that I would love to see a more communication between theologians and scientists, that because it's not happening on the street. It's not happening in the hospitals. It's not happening in the schools, right where kids need to have an understanding of evolution to recognize that it's what we know now, and it may change later. When we're studying physics and mathematics, if students can have a better understanding, I think it would bring meaning to the youth today, because I think that's what's happening. The brain doesn't even form itself well until about 25, the prefrontal cortex. And then you have so much mental illness that they diagnose around 24. So, we're in the middle of a challenging world that can be helped just by, I guess, theological literacy of recognizing, hey, let's talk about the difference between science and theology, but at least let's allow students and scientists. And I really, really believe that scientists should have a crash course, maybe in comparative religions, a crash course in, understanding, whether they believe or not, but just have an understanding of, okay, you believe in, say, panpsychism or whatever, but let's look at, monotheism and how those two relate.
Yep. No, I see. And you mentioned panpsychism there, and a lot of times when I was looking into that, I was like, well, I'm coming from an atheist background. I mean, not all my life, of course. I was raised by an innumerable amount of my family members, so I was spent time in a lot of different denominations, but mostly always within the Christian religion. Um, but I became very militantly atheist throughout my teenage years and everything, and was a big time proponent of making sure religion was getting out of the landscape of my being and promoted against it. Not promoted like actively, but in my own expression of myself, I was very anti-religion and all those kinds of things. And what is important, like you're saying, is to bring people to God through science is a very integral point, because as we go forward, we're starting to see there was like this wave of new atheism, as I call it, that I was a member of. I feel like, I mean, we try to put terms on generational eras that are kind of small and compacted, but from like the early 2000s until just recently, it seems like there was this wave of intellectual furthering of these agnostic atheist ideas by proponents of it that were able to do so in such a way that they could convey to the millennials and in their audience that captured their minds. And that was kind of the best way I can say that. And it was people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, and they could really say it with the words that needed to be said with to get the millennials to buy it in a way that was almost religious. And so I call it a dogmatic kind of way of restructuring meaning that was occurring. And now it seems like a shift, at least towards more characters like Jordan Peterson and people like that, who are at least bringing theology back into this into this sector of language where I'm kind of comparing it a lot to language. The way the words are used to convey these ideas are starting to become more advanced, and it's gotten people to the point where they can't figure it out without submitting to spiritual language, without submitting to metaphors and allegories and things like that. And so I see a lot of intrigue in what you said about you have to usher people back to the church through science somehow or another, because it's scientifically minded. So now that even if it's incorrect, that scientism has taken over, we still have to roll out the red carpet to those people in a way that gives them a way back to the church, because the church can say, well, we have too many atheists. Well, the church has a role to play in that, I think. And you're, as a pastor yourself, do you find yourself, this has brought me to this question now, inadvertently, but do you find yourself having to do that, to not to mislead, but to garner more people and your congregation to merge science and religion? Do you do a lot of that in your work as a pastor, kind of trying to make these topics on the same playing level so that people can get from atheism to Christianity in a more accessible route, so to speak?
Yeah, 100%. I think the Sunday sermon was Perfect Genes, where we spoke about genes and, how does God see genetics? And we went to John 9 about the man born blind. So the man was born blind. And so his disciples say, who sinned, this man or his parents? And that's Jesus dealing with a genetic subject, genetics of somebody born blind. Obviously, it was some genetic abnormality or whatever that allowed him to be born blind or in utero. And so we were able to approach that subject, the way Jesus said it. He said, hey, there's nothing wrong with him. So the works of God can be glorified. That if somebody's born, they're doing great. The fact that they're born, there's value in birth. There's value in that. And that's an attempt to recognize that we don't have, theology shouldn't run from science. And I think that science actually helps, as you said, understand theology. And I think to be honest with you, and that the onus falls on the theologians, falls on the denominations, it falls on the doctrines to be able to recognize that everybody has a cell phone now and they can Google anything. I mean, they can find out any amount of information. So like you said, Dawkins and Steven Pinker and so many determinists and, atheists, that they own the public space right now. That is the information that's dominating everything. And then on the Christian side, denominational issues are dominating things, politics and so forth, as opposed to the Bible itself, as opposed to the love of the gospel. So what people see, they see science on one side that's refusing to recognize the concept of metaphysics. And then on the other side, they see denominational dog fights, I call it. I hate to use that word, but just all kind of issues that that's not discussing the forgiveness of God. And so it's allowing you, like, hey, I was with you. I didn't come to Christ till I was 35. I tried everything I thought I could try, and so, but what's needed now is the church to have a gospel of love, to bring that truth in. And I think, again, science gives tools more than we've ever had. We literally have all the tools now to discuss, monogamy, pair bonding. We can discuss, healthy eating. Again, we can discuss, I never forget, wrote a article response on in Britain. They have these groups that doctors assign people to social groups. All right, social prescribing, because particularly elderly, they're sitting at home by themselves. They'll be assigned to a social group as social prescribing. Well, that doesn't make sense. You tell them to go to church. You know what I mean? Like, church has what people need. It has it has the relationships. It has the structure. It has somebody to make sure people aren't getting raped and abused, supposedly. It gives a theology that that science can relate to. So there's so many things involved in the way in which the church is designed that, again, lines up with symbiosis. And so what the church has to do is make that argument. And I think that that's kind of the challenge there. I think science has done much of what it needs to do. It needs to listen, but the argument needs to go to those that have the floor. That, hey, let's just talk about love, but let's talk about practical things that's going on in the world today, particularly that's happening in people's lives, what they eat and how they live, how they make a living, and the importance of human relationships, touch, and so forth.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're spot on with what you're saying about there's a social network element of embodiment of practice and embodiment of what we consider sacred, what we hold as our highest objective, and we actualize ourselves towards love, hope, like you had said, love being the cornerstone of the Christian religion, is a lot of times seemingly and metaphorically extracted out of the doctrine when it's handed down from the pulpit to the members of the congregation. And that's my subjective experience. I know there's a lot of love in all these churches just by the nature of them being a church. However, there sometimes is a message that seems to me a little bit off center from what Jesus came to speak with, and the grace and the forgiveness, like you had just said. And love being the cornerstone of it all brings people back together to that without being so divisive in its nature of fracturization and things like that, and pushing away of others through that. And so I think that, like you said, it's important that as we go to church, we begin to embody this more. Like, I think what you were kind of saying is when we gather in a building and we're all there, we're all acknowledging a shared common logos or a shared common driving force behind our actions. Because we talked about free will earlier. And why are we all at this church? Well, we're obviously all utilized our will to come to one building to acknowledge what we hold the most sacred and the most true and the most dear to what our consciousness is based upon, what our foundational beliefs are held to be, the container by which holds all of those. And so, yeah, I think there has to be something ultimately, like you had said, something ultimately critical about the social aspect of gathering and coming together as one unit to acknowledge the one thing that we all hold true and dear. And like we were talking about science, I spoke with a gentleman, Dr. Andrew Newberg is his name, and he does a lot of work on the study of neurotheology, as he calls it, and basically the science of enlightenment, or the brain imaging that revolves around spiritual and mystical experiences. And I think that like any of this work is, it stays a little bit in the metaphysical, but he tries his work is so much to bring that into the non-metaphysical as much as possible, to help show people that, hey, there is something to prayer, there is something to contemplation, there is something happening neurologically and epigenetically. So that, I guess, would circle back to that's changing the brain for people when they go through these kinds of experiences. and when they gather in church and after they leave, what their brain looks like, and just in those time frames. And so I think that it's kind of neat to me to see that there's scientific investigation happening on things like enlightenment, and that's a word that carries too much ascending weight to me for a human to say that they're enlightened. I'm just saying that's kind of how we determine or talk about these transformations. And to bring this all full circle here, because we've been going for about an hour and a half, but I wanted to kind of end with asking you, since you had mentioned epigenetics and Christ earlier, and I was just now talking about kind of the changing of the brain through mystical experiences, you mentioned epigenetics and Christ and God's relationship to genetics. And I know you talked about in your last sermon, God and genes and that relationship. What do you see ultimately, or just get your opinion, do you see human beings as being able to induce epigenetic changes within themselves by reorienting towards something like God and changing their sense of self and reorienting their self to being less than other? When that happens, how far do you see the epigenetics being? Is it like 60%, 40% phenotype, genotype? And does our consciousness potentially, like you were saying, Christ had a conscious? Do you think we can evolve our consciousness to change our genetics, or how that relationship works? I'm sorry, I know that was a lot there. I didn't mean to go on and on as I did.
No, it's beautiful. I think I'm going to make 2 points. The first one is, theology never has to prove itself within science, because it can't. It'll be impossible, because again, it's metaphysics, it's belief. Because scientists can say, well, that's not the truth. It's irrelevant. Because we're purely in theology. Once we move into that world of metaphysics, that's actually where we stay. We use, say, the neuroscience, we use the genetics and so forth. But I always say it's like beautiful illustrations of what's happening in the spirit realm. And so, but with that, since we do believe in spirit, that spirit exists, so therefore, God is omniscient. He knows everything. Omnipresent. He's everywhere. So God created genes. He created chromosomes. He created everything. So God allows the wind to blow, allows the sun to be hot. God allows this. All right. And so that's the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. God can heal. He can do whatever he wants to do, not just epigenetic changes. So when we pray, God, I speak healing, we're not just speaking an immune response, that because of the relaxation, my immune system is going to be more relaxed, and therefore I don't have the stress anymore. So therefore that's going to affect my hormones and more parasympathetic as far as parasympathetic. God is a spirit. So we're believing he can do actual spiritual transformation of any part of the body, let alone the genes. And so again, I say that's where the balance, homoousios, that third person of the Holy Spirit. Once we believe the Holy Spirit exists, then he can talk to our spirit. The Holy Spirit can change things. He can do whatever. I mean, there's nothing impossible for God at that point. And science is not supposed to study that, because they couldn't. You know what I mean? They say that's crazy. Well, it is. It's metaphysics. But my argument to those that are non-deterministic, once they put their little pinky into the water of emergence, they're in theology. And so I'm saying, why not go all the way, go deep in and say, God, I'm going to trust you and you run my life.
Beautifully said. Yeah. And I agree. I think going back to the ultimate idea, the hard problem of consciousness, where we started, and is the idea of subjectivity, and all of that is a way by which I see to bring people back to, and it's not like proselytizing or trying to go and herd up all the sheep. It's more, and because I have no pedestal by to speak from, I think it's just a good attack angle to take a scientifically minded person and really show them the inadequacies of science to explain the hard problem. It's not a problem to, like we were saying, it's only a problem if you make it one. And that's what I've come to realize. However, if you can almost usher in people who are atheistically minded to this debate, and they can begin to taste the wild attempts, like you said at the beginning, to go and use language to convey the subjectivity aspect of our being. You see thousands of theories of consciousness proposed like every year.
Yeah.
You see the most brilliant-minded people in the world trying their hardest to explain the most basic element of existence. I mean, they try hard. I mean, there's 35-page long to explain thought, and it still doesn't quite. And that's awesome. That's what we want in science, is this constant dueling of ideas and this arena by which ideas duke it out, and the best one reigns supreme. But I'm telling kind of that once you realize that there might be a little easier explanation to the subjectivity of our existence, you start realizing that science is trying really hard to reason God out of the equation, and they come up with things like panpsychism and emergence. And you start looking at panpsychism and emergence, and you realize, well, that's just another way of saying we don't know what's going on here. Well, it must predate our existence. And so we have emergent consciousness that exists in panpsychic universe. Well, then we have human spirit existing within God's universe, essentially.
Oh, that is good. But when you think about things like the multiverse theory, well, maybe there's another universe. I'm like, okay.
Exactly. So the metaphysics do reign supreme, and I think that it's at least a shifting in the landscape right now in the dialogue a little bit more towards that. And so I wanted to say, kind of end with that, and once again say that I have a lot of gratitude for you for coming on here and talking with me and taking some of your precious time to go over these. I think this is an important dialogue to have, and it means a whole lot to me for you to come on and talk with me. So I wanted to say thank you one more time.
No, I have to thank you. I'm still trying to figure out the name, philosophical gospel. That is just amazing. I just love it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I don't know where it came from really, but I kind of went through a few different names and settled on this one, saying maybe I'll try to spread the gospel philosophically in some way or another. So I appreciate the kind words and appreciate your time once again. And I'm sure we'll hopefully speak in the future. And I look forward to your work, your continuing work. And hope others will come to it through this discussion too, and go and look into your work, because it's very fascinating. And so once again, thank you very much, Dr. Sylvain, and I hope we'll speak in the future. But I thank you very much for your time today and very much enjoyed it.
No, thank you so much. Enjoyed every minute of it and truly honored. Thank you. Awesome work you're doing. Thank you so much. That means a whole lot to me. You take care, and we'll talk soon. Have a great rest of your day. You too. Enjoy. Okay.
Take
care.